A massive explosion has severely damaged the strategically important road and rail bridge connecting occupied Crimea to Russia. The UN nuclear watchdog calls for the urgent protection of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant in Ukraine after shelling cuts its external power.
President Putin has suffered an embarrassing setback in the war with Ukraine after a huge explosion on the only bridge linking Russia with the Crimean Peninsula. The bridge partially collapsed, but it has now reopened to light traffic. Well, Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and after occupying these regions of Ukraine in red, it has managed to establish a corridor up through southern and eastern Ukraine. The Kerch bridge connecting Russia to the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea was an important supply route for sending Russian troops and artillery into Ukraine. And the blast there is another humiliation for the Kremlin, as our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg now reports.
It is the bridge the Kremlin built, and it was under attack. An explosion at dawn. This was the result. Russian officials claim a lorry had been blown up here, and that the fire then spread to a fuel train. Whatever the cause, you can see the damage. This is the bridge that links Russia to annexed Crimea, and parts of the road had collapsed into the sea. Later, investigators announced that 3 people had been killed. They've opened a criminal case. The 12-mile-long road and rail bridge is not only strategically important to the Kremlin as a supply route, it's also a symbol of the Russian annexation of Crimea. Vladimir Putin opened it in 2018, getting behind the wheel to show that, as far as he was concerned, Russia and Crimea were joined forever. Very different scenes today. Pro-Kremlin commentators have blamed Ukraine for the explosion, but there's been no claim of responsibility from Kiev. It is noticeable how the situation has changed here, and the messaging. A few months ago, Russians were being told by their leaders and by the state media that the so-called special military operation would be relatively brief and victorious. Now they're being told that there are problems, that Russia is losing ground. And today they learned about the attack on a hugely symbolic location, the Crimean Bridge. News of the attack has sparked concern amongst the public here. But the Russians we spoke to had different ideas about how the Kremlin should react. It's worrying, Stas says. War is always bad. They should have done this differently, with negotiations. But Olga says Putin must respond. What a birthday present they gave him. We should blow up the train lines Ukraine uses to get its military aid from America. This is NATO's fault. But from Vladimir Putin, there's been no reaction yet to what happened here. No hint as to how he will respond. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, St. Petersburg.
And live now to our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams, who's in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv. Paul, what are the Ukrainian authorities saying about this?
I can tell you, Ben, Ukrainians in general are absolutely cock-a-hoop. For them, this is like the sinking of the Moskva, the Russian flagship of the Black Sea Fleet back in April. This is a real moment of national delight. Just to give you a bit of an indication, the Ukrainian Post Office has already announced that it plans to issue a postage stamp celebrating the hit on the bridge over the Kerch Strait. The symbolism of that attack is enormous here too. Now, experts I've spoken to have said that they think this was probably a result of an extremely expertly executed sabotage operation, almost certainly by Ukrainian special forces. But a presidential advisor just about an hour or so ago said, no, this was actually the result of infighting in Moscow. Was he trolling the Russians, playing on signs of division within the Russian defense establishment? We simply don't know. It seems as though this was a very good day, though, for Ukraine.
The head of the UN nuclear watchdog says the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine must be protected urgently after shelling again out all external power. Earlier, I spoke with our correspondent in Kyiv, Hugo Bashega, and asked him how much concern there is for what's happening at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant.
Well, for weeks, this nuclear power station has been at the center of concerns because of the level of military activity happening around it. The Russians invaded this complex at the very beginning of the war, and the Ukrainians have been saying that Russian troops have essentially turned this nuclear facility into a military base, using it as a nuclear shield to launch attacks, knowing that Ukrainian forces are unlikely to retaliate. Now, President Zelensky said more than 500 Russian troops, heavily armed, are there, positioned in this complex, and the nuclear operators, the Ukrainian staff, are still operating this facility, working under very stressful, difficult conditions. So Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, released a statement in the last hour or so, saying that the station must be protected urgently. He's been calling for the creation of a safety zone around this facility. He was here in Kyiv earlier this week. He's due to visit Moscow to try to push ahead with this plan to try to create this safety zone around the nuclear facility. And he said in a tweet that after this visit to Moscow, he's going to return here to Kyiv to try to create this safety area around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear facility.